Hey guys, imagine a world where discretion was a luxury, privacy was a myth, and your every intimate act was as public as market day. Welcome to medieval Europe, where the most absurd bedroom antics would give even the hardiest modern mind a shock. Picture candlelit chambers echoing with the squeak of wooden buckles, the rustle of hempen sheets, and the cries of villagers who discovered the limits of human ingenuity, and perhaps madness, under a canopy of superstition. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. The first unsettling delight in our medieval carnival of carnal curiosities is the legendary hygienic practice of communal bathing, or rather the lack thereof. While modern spa-goers relax in scented steam rooms, medieval folk believed that too much water endangered the soul, prying open pores for unsavory spirits. As a result, they relied on fragrant pomanders and oil rubs to mask their scent, gathering in cramped bathhouses where every intimate nook was public property. Patrons splashed and scrubbed under the discerning gaze of neighbors, trading gossip as vigorously as scrubbing away grime. It wasn't long before bathwater, thick with the residues of dozens of strangers, became a murky testament to humanity's resilience, or stubbornness, against proper hygiene. Soon, the guiding principle of medieval intimacy revealed itself. If it's weird, make it communal. Exhibit B, the infamous chastity stews, boiling cauldrons where jealous suitors supposedly dunked beloved garments to test for evidence of passion. If the silken sash didn't foam, the theory went, the wearer had remained pure. Foam meant hormone-driven betrayal. This rudimentary litmus test of fidelity turned simple laundry into a tribunal of trust, as entire villages gathered awaiting that telltale froth, and perhaps a public shaming. The practice was less about science and more about spectacle, a theatrical farce parading through every market square. Next up is the torturous torment disguised as romance. Potions and ointments infused with the most bewildering ingredients. Medieval medical texts brim with recipes calling for the bodily fluids of exotic creatures, vials of bat sputum, powdered toad venom, or pulverized earthworms, promise to ignite desire or ward off impotence. Lovers desperate for an edge would ingest these foul mixtures, certain that alchemy could trump affection. Poor souls often found themselves doubled over in agony, convinced they'd been cursed rather than cured. Modern pharmacists might cringe, but medieval apothecaries peddled these concoctions with the confidence of sommeliers pouring a vintage wine. Yet nothing screams, "we know what we're doing," like the erotic symbolism in religious art. Stained glass windows, frescoes, and illuminated manuscripts frequently depicted saints and sinners in poses that would make modern erotica blush. Allegorical figures of lust and chastity wrestled, their bodies entwined in grotesque contortions that served as both warnings against sin and, paradoxically, inspiration for the curious. Peasants passing by the cathedral might glimpse these scenes, their imaginations ignited by the very sermons meant to tame them. The line between moral instruction and salacious titillation blurred under the prism of poor lighting and powerful storytelling. Moving away from the public eye, consider the ritual of the marriage bed trial, a post-nuptial inspection where midwives and local witnesses verified a bride's virginity by examining her blood-stained linen. That once private moment became a public display of honor. If the sheet was unblemished, the bride faced suspicion, humiliation, or accusations of deceit. Local troubadours might even compose ballads about the drama, forever binding a couple's most intimate details to village lore. Privacy, it seems, was the first casualty in the quest for social reputation. As if mythic trials weren't enough, medieval lovers often turned to astrology to schedule their trysts. Positions of the moon, stars, and wandering planets dictated auspicious nights for conception, or could doom a liaison to ill fortune. Some couples kept elaborate star charts beside their beds, whispering sweet nothings only when Mars was favorably aligned. Missed that window and you risked bearing a cursed child or fostering impotence. The notion that love obeyed celestial edicts added a cosmic layer of anxiety, turning the bedroom into a mini observatory of angst-ridden hope. Meanwhile, the noble courts took perversity to new heights with the extravagant display of love gloves, embroidered with secret messages and scented with rare perfumes. A nobleman might slip his lady a gauntlet perfumed with musk or rosewater, its intricate stitching spelling out coded invitations. Meet me in the garden at moonrise, or your eyes outshine the stars. Of course, the practicality of dancing through thorny hedges or bribing guards to rendezvous could turn these clandestine gestures into tearful escapades worthy of a Shakespearean comedy. But for pure medieval absurdity, nothing tops the ritual of water divination, ufology, as quacks called it, where lovers peered into reflective surfaces of bowls filled with water, wine, or oil, seeking images of their beloved's face. Some believers claimed that swirling dregs revealed intimate secrets, while skeptics insisted it was just a trick of light. Yet this early version of seeing into your future love life captivated the romantically inclined, offering tantalizing glimpses of phantom lovers in every wisp of steam. Equally bewildering was the so-called courtesan's oath, an unofficial pact among professional lovers in certain cities, pledging mutual protection and sharing of clientele. These guild-like associations enforced rules: no pilfering another's patron, no betrayal of secrets, and strict codes of sanitation. Ironic, given the general distaste for baths. Members met in hidden taverns to exchange news, negotiate services, and sometimes arbitrate disputes with mock trials, complete with a judge draped in velvet and a jury of peers sipping spiced wine. Closing out our first foray into medieval sexual escapades is the darker practice of lovelock funerals. When a lover died far from home, the bereaved would place a lock of hair and a personal trinket in the coffin, believing these relics could bind the departed spirit to their own dreams of reunion. Grieving spouses might wander cemeteries at night, calling into the darkness for ghostly embraces. Superstitious villagers whispered that on certain nights, wraithly lovers drifted from their graves in search of fleshly comfort, a haunting climax to a life of earthly passions. By the dawn's light, your eyes may well crave the comfort of modernity's prudish norms. But take heart, our ancestors survived, if only barely, through belief in magic, communal embarrassments, and remedies that would scandalize any contemporary apothecary. Their tireless pursuit of pleasure, in spite of plague, famine, and moral condemnation, reveals an indomitable longing for connection that transcends time. Stick around for part 2, where we'll unearth even more lunacy, from bed traps rigged with bells to erotic talismans carved from vampire teeth. Until then, keep your almanac close and your chamber pot closer. History's nightmares are just getting started. Now, let's plunge back into our medieval chamber of curiosities, where every sinister shadow could conceal a thong, every tapestry a trap, and every whispered promise a wretched prank on human dignity. If you thought the last round of shared bathwater and cauldron-born fidelity tests was bizarre, brace yourselves. Here come the next 10 delights that turn the Middle Ages into one prolonged, but oddly entertaining, voyeur's nightmare. Begin with the notorious bed traps rigged with bells. In an age when cuckoldry was both shameful and legally actionable, ingenious grooms sometimes outfitted their bridal beds with strings attached to little bells. Should an uninvited paramour slip between the linens, the clangor would sound, summoning the in-laws, the local bailiff, and the entire neighborhood. Watch in a matter of heartbeats. Imagine a scandalous tryst thus interrupted by the tinny chorus of matrimonial mechanical justice, like a medieval smoke alarm, only with more recriminations and far less common sense. For the unlucky lover caught mid-swoon, the sudden cacophony could induce a cardiac event rivaling any jousting accident. Next up, erotic talismans carved from vampire teeth, or at least what medieval folk believed were the fangs of the undead. These grisly mementos, often set in silver or bone, were thought to hold aphrodisiacal properties. Lovers would press them against aching loins or tuck them into undergarments, convinced that the undead's eternal hunger for blood would translate into ravenous passion in the boudoir. Of course, sourcing real vampire teeth posed complications. Many peasants resorted to scraping animal fangs or cobbling together cheap imitations, yet the placebo effect proved remarkably potent, and more than one rustic liaison ended in unexpected ecstasy, if only by virtue of the wearer's blood rushing back from momentary shock. Our next stop along the path of peculiar passions is the penitential whip. Yes, you heard that right. Self-flagellation for pleasure. While public whipping was widely employed for criminals and heretics, certain mystics and nuns began adapting the practice into an erotic ritual. They reasoned that the sting of leather could purge the soul and fuel carnal longing in a pious paradox. Veiled sisters would discreetly lash themselves with knotted cords, tears streaming as both penance and perverse delight. Their confessions, sometimes scribbled in hidden margins of prayer books, reveal a complex interplay of guilt, devotion, and randy reprieve. And though the church officially condemned such antics, enforcement was tricky. After all, how do you discipline an inquisitor's favorite whipping post? Meanwhile, holiday feasts devolved into orgiastic spectacles under the guise of religious revelry. Feast days honoring saints or seasonal change often featured masked balls, where the devil's mask was all too literal. Nobles and serfs alike donned grotesque disguises. Horned demons, skeletal jesters, ogres with flailing tongues, and indulged in wine-soaked debauchery. The masks provided plausible deniability. Who, me? The fellow in the goatskin mask? So no one hesitated to swap partners in a merry-go-round of moral ambiguity. The wails of accordions and howls of mirth echoed through candlelit halls, drowning out any vestiges of modesty. Venture now into the realm of animal-themed erotica, bestiality rumors that rival modern tabloid headlines. While such practices were relatively rare, the specter of animals in the bedroom loomed large in folk ballads, legal treatises, and pulp chronicles. Peasants sometimes whispered of goats moonlighting as unlicensed lovers. Noblemen, philosophers of the grotesque, allegedly dabbled in onyx-eyed panther fantasies, commissioning secret paintings that hid behind castle tapestries. Trial records, often sensationalized, chronicled sensational confessions. I was seized by a ravenous sow being the most famous. Whether widespread fact or fanciful fiction, these stories fueled public panic and occasional witch hunts, as villagers blamed misfortunes on perverted unions between man and beast. Turning a corner down the dimly lit corridor, we encounter the bizarre practice of post-coital curses. In an era dominated by superstition, jilted lovers would inscribe hexes on scraps of parchment, roll them into tiny scrolls, and bind them with hair plucked from their own heads. After uttering a string of unintelligible syllables, often thought to be Latin gibberish, they'd toss these talismans into wells, fireplaces, or the latrine pits of their ex's abode. Fantasy held that the curse, riding on the spiritus of bodily essence, would infect the target with maladies ranging from impotence to uncontrollable flatulence. Legal authorities occasionally prosecuted these witchly maleficia, though proving cause and effect was understandably difficult when the victim simply blamed the local rat invasion. From curses to cooking, medieval erotic cookbooks, though rare, did exist. These arcane volumes combined recipe and romance, offering instructions like stir the pot of marrow with a man's hair to heighten ardor, or serve figs soaked in honey and rosewater while whispering vows of undying lust. The scribes behind these books claimed to draw on ancient wisdom from classical poets, but their texts often mixed culinary science with outright absurdity. Imagine a candlelit kitchen, a couple stirring a bubbling cauldron while reciting rhymes to coax the goddess of fertility. Equal parts theatrical ritual and proto-reality cooking show. Meanwhile, those desperate to verify their partner's fidelity turn to the oldest mirror in the house, not for reflection, but for scrying. Known as the dish of revelations, this polished metal bowl was filled with diluted wine or oil. The anxious spouse would gaze into its depths, seeking anything from distorted faces to flying insects that allegedly symbolized infidelity. More practical observers, unimpressed by supernatural claims, used the bowl simply to check for lipstick smudges or suspicious beard hairs. Yet, the aura of mysticism turned every glance into a nail-biting moment, as one spouse waited for a sign, any sign, that love might be elsewhere. Let us not forget the clandestine world of traveling sex manuals, pocket-sized treatises bound in worn leather, smuggled between border towns. These secret books contain diagrams borrowed from medical texts, explaining positions, potions, and pitfalls. Owners guarded them closely, passing them only to trusted confidants under penalty of public humiliation. Sometimes whole caravans of pilgrims carried these manuals alongside rosaries, comparing notes as they traversed muddy roads to Santiago de Compostela. The irony? Many manuals contained warnings condemning lust, warning readers that misapplication of the techniques could result in spontaneous abortions or the dreaded leaping sickness, a catch-all term for any inexplicable malady. As we near the conclusion of Part 2, consider the bizarre ritual of nightly vigil for conception. Couples seeking children would keep vigil in specially consecrated chambers, complete with protective charms, incense, and a small band of witnesses. These onlookers, often family members or local clerics, observe the couple's union, ready to note any misstep that might doom the conception ritual. Their notes, recorded on parchment, serve both as proof of compliance with church doctrine and as a communal diary that might embarrass future generations. Imagine the awkward pressure of performing for an audience whose keenest interest lay not in tenderness, but in theological correctness. Finally, the pièce de résistance of medieval sexual absurdity, the traveling court of liberation, known in some regions as the Carnival of Consent. This temporary troupe of actors, musicians, and libertines would set up a makeshift stage at fairs, performing risque plays that doubled as erotic education. Scenes depicted everything from the virtues of anal douching with rosemary-infused water to the benefits of bridal knots meant to enhance intimacy. After the performance, the troupe distributed pamphlets, printed on ancient presses, detailing the evening's lessons in crude woodcut illustrations. Unsuspecting families seeking simple amusement sometimes found themselves clutching these pamphlets, forced to explain their presence to outraged neighbors. And with that cavalcade of medieval mischief, we pause in our journey, your mind perhaps reeling from visions of fanged talismans and communal bedchambers rigged with bells. But do not close your almanacs yet. Part 3 awaits, promising even more grotesque illuminations, ranging from pregnancy predictions by snail trails to the anathematized art of the lover's ladder. Until then, keep one eye on the night sky and the other on your neighbor's chamber pot, because in the Middle Ages you never knew which weird practice would crawl through the keyhole next. Now that you've survived bed traps, vampire fangs, and self-flagellation for your old joy, prepare yourself for the next descent into medieval depravity. In this installment, we unearth 10 more rituals that would make even the most jaded modern viewer clutch their duvet in terror. From snail-sealing fertility tests to gravity-defying love ladders, let's plunge into a world where sexual science was little more than guesswork cloaked in superstition, and the results, predictably, were riotously absurd. First up, the snail trail pregnancy oracle. Desperate couples who yearned for offspring but feared the wrath of fate turned to mollusks for answers. They'd place a line of snails across a smudged cloth, sometimes lightly anointed with rosewater or wine, and wait. Legend held that the speed and direction of the snail's mucus trail indicated fertility prospects. A swift, straight glide foretold imminent conception. A meandering, faltering path spelled barren months ahead. Participants observed from trembling distance, clutching prayer beads in one hand, their significant other's hand in the other, though whether for comfort or to coax the snail forward remains hazy. Few documented successes emerged, but countless couples swore to the snail's prophetic prowess, crediting the little gastropods for every childbirth while conveniently ignoring months of empty cloth. Next, behold the lover's ladder, an ingeniously awkward device requiring both balance and trust. Crafted from polished limewood or braided reeds, the ladder featured 12 rungs of gradually widening spacing. Designed as a test of agility and affection, couples ascended naked candles in hand, pausing at each rung to perform an intimate act. A stolen kiss here, a whispered vow there. The final step demanded full extension, partners standing on opposite sides, leaning back to meet at a precarious midpoint, all while reciting incantations to Venus. Those who reached the apex without tumbling were deemed blessed by the gods and said to enjoy eternal passion. Those who plummeted endured bruises and mortifying laughter from onlookers. Despite the frequent spills, nobles commissioned their own ornamental ladders as status symbols. After all, nothing says "I love you" like risking a shattered pelvis in public spectacle. Meanwhile, in rural hamlets, unmarried folk turned to the practice of the moorhen gambit. On certain feast nights, single men placed live moorhens beneath their beds, believing the birds' nocturnal clucking would spark nocturnal emissions or at least signal the need for sweaty nocturnal consolations. Wives, naturally, protested the flapping, scratched feathers and the subsequent infestation of lice. but folklore insisted that the moorhen's mystical poultry essence held secrets of virility. Local midwives sold talismans carved in the shape of bird beaks, promising to harness the avian libido for more predictable results. Unsurprisingly, the gambit led to more poultry feathers in the sheets than babies in the cradle. Beyond animal co-conspirators, many medieval lovers lusted after magical lighting. The cresset of carnal flames involved candles infused with exotic oils, peppercorn, poppy, even bezoar essence, placed strategically around the bed. They believed these scented flames could heighten sensory perception, transforming a routine tryst into an otherworldly experience. Some recipes called for blending sulfur powder into the wax to spark tiny sparks at the wick, purportedly symbolizing the sparks of passion. Of course, many a tryst ended in scorched linens or startled servants racing in to extinguish the blaze, but that only added to the thrill. Nothing bonds two people like mutual panic and flickering half-light. Turning to texts, the so-called Treatise of 12 Pleasures circulated in clandestine scribal circles. This pocket tome, bound in vellum and hidden behind holy scripture in church libraries, cataloged positions ranging from the reclining peacock to the brewer's squeeze. Each entry came with elaborate instructions. Let her legs rest upon your shoulders as you arch like a bow, whispering verses of the Divine Comedy to steady breath. The aristocracy prized these treatises as both scandalous guide and intellectual curiosity. Secret gatherings, often in abbey basements, featured readings aloud of particularly graphic chapters, drawing gasps and titters as listeners adjusted their codpieces in a flurry of excitement and embarrassment. Meanwhile, the alchemist's kiss sought to merge science and succor. Practitioners believed that by applying a paste of powdered gold and crushed gemstone atop the lips before a kiss, lovers could exchange not just breath, but transmutable energies. Plates of moonstone dust were left on bedside tables, and couples took turns dipping their lips, convinced that gold's incorruptibility would cement fidelity. Conspiracies abounded. Some accused goldsmiths of hoarding wealth by promoting the practice. Others claimed counterfeit jewels caused rashes and madness. Yet in the dim glow of tallow lamps, the promise of alchemical intimacy proved too seductive to resist. No medieval survey would be complete without courtly disrobement rituals designed to maximize anticipation. At certain noble courts, suitors presented themselves fully clothed before a dais, while their potential paramour remained concealed behind an ornate screen. Each suitor removed one garment at a time, gloves, cloak, doublet, revealing bits of linen-clad flesh until only breeches remained. The lady hidden behind velvet drapes judged based on technique, dignity of removal, and how elegantly one handled the embarrassment. Successful suitors received a token, perhaps a ribbon or scented glove, permitting private access after dusk. Tales circulate of prized breeches auctioned in wine halls, fetching fortunes for the most dexterous performers. Meanwhile, in monastic enclaves, errant monks devised the Silence of Desire challenge. Two brothers in habit would share a cell for a fortnight, forbidden to speak but permitted to touch, though only if no other brother stood within earshot. This vow of mutual muteness ostensibly strengthened spiritual bonds, but rumors suggest it doubled as an elaborate game of hide-and-seek, bottom halves covered in coarse wool. They navigated the cramped quarters with whispered hums and interpretive gestures. When the fortnight ended, a local abbot judged their restraint, or lack thereof, based on the condition of their habits. Records hint at reprimands, forced penances, and occasional expulsions for those judged too lax. In seaside towns, fishermen adapted their trade into libidinous ritual. The saltwater anointment involved bathing in the morning catch, herring, cod, and eels, then rubbing brine and fish oils onto the body. Couples believed that the ocean's fertility would seep into their flesh, boosting reproductive vigor. Some risked infection, many succumbed to the smell. Yet the practice persisted until a stern bishop banned fishy fumigations in bedchambers, citing scripture about clean waters and clean spirits. Fishermen grumbled but complied, relocating the ritual to secluded coves at dawn, much to the dismay of gulls and bathers. Next, the mirror oath of mutual gazing asked couples to stare into a single two-sided mirror for the duration of the waning moon. Legend said that sustaining unbroken eye contact would bind souls permanently, ensuring lifelong understanding, and, incidentally, perfect sexual compatibility. Participants documented dizzy spells, hallucinations of disembodied faces, and vertigo. Many abandoned the ritual half-blind, but a few proclaimed miraculous insights. One gentleman swore he saw his lover's loved ones from beyond the grave, reflected behind her iris. The church, wary of spirit visions, banned mirrors of that size in private chapels, but the practice lingered among folk healers who offered sanctioned looking glasses for a fee. Last but hardly least, behold the celestial intercourse clock. Nobles outfitted their chambers with ivory dials marked with signs of the zodiac, solstices, and saint feast days. Every hour corresponded to a specific act: fawn play under Taurus, gentle whispering in Gemini, full embraces when Leo soared. Couples tracked time with a candle klaxon. A thin metal rod inserted into a slow-burning candle would drop a metal bead into a bowl at each hour, prompting them to shift position or recite a saintly prayer before continuing. The slightly smoky, tinned clang added a sense of ritualized suspense. While contemporary sleep researchers might scoff, medieval couples swore by the clock's power to banish monotony and bring structure to an otherwise unruly boudoir. By now, your mind may spin with visions of snail slime, gold-dusted kisses, and fish bath reenactments, but the Middle Ages knew no shame, only spectacle, superstition, and an unshakable faith that even the most outlandish practice could unlock the mysteries of the flesh. If you thought Part 3 was a carnival of carnal chaos, buckle up. Part 4 will chart the final frontier, revealing the twisted world of pregnancy-sniffing beagles, sacrificial bath rituals, and the legendary phantom consort who haunted castles by night. Until then, keep your almanac at the ready, and maybe swap your snail testers for a modern pregnancy stick. Medieval love may have been a madhouse, but it was one hell of a show. Now, as the moon reaches its zenith and your nerve endings tingle with morbid curiosity, we enter the final chapter of medieval madness, where every ritual borders on the blasphemous, every superstition amplifies the absurd, and survival meant enduring the strangest tests of flesh and faith. Brace yourself for the last 10 spectacles, from dogged pregnancy detection to ghostly lovers who haunted castle corridors. These closing acts will cement your conviction that modern humanity is, in fact, quite sensible. First, the pregnancy-sniffing beagle. In villages where secrecy was scant and rumor ran rampant, desperate families enlisted special hounds, supposed experts in detecting new life. Midwives led the beagle around a suspect mother's waist 3 times at dawn, offering the dog morsels of soot to sniff. A wagging tail heralded yes. Lethargic disinterest signaled no. Villagers swore by the method, even as skeptical physicians scoffed at canine diagnosis. Failures, often caused by underfed dogs or sweat-saturated nostrils, could devastate reputations. A false positive meant public congratulations and bridal arrangements. A false negative meant accusations of witchcraft. Yet beagles remained in demand, prized for their loyalty and inexplicable sniffing instinct. Next comes the sacrificial bath ritual. When a nobleman fell ill after a Moorish exploits, courtiers believed the solution lay in a purifying soak. They carved a marble or iron bathtub deep enough for immersion, lit candles around its rim, and placed offerings, wine, frankincense, and the severed locks of a willing partner, into the water. The patient stepped in fully clothed, the attendants chanting psalms while drenching him in the scented brew. One by one, they cast herbs and crushed pearls into the bath, convinced the water would absorb sin and sickness alike. Success was measured in fever reduction, failure in premature raising of bathers who slipped on oily floors. Still, the ritual endured as both medical treatment and theatrical display of piety. Then, the hare's leap of love, a bizarre courtship test in certain German principalities. A young suitor introduced his chosen hare, a prized farm rabbit, into a ring drawn in chalk on the ground. His intended waited at one edge, the suitor at the opposite. Upon a signal, they each sprinted to the circle's center, seized the rabbit, and held it aloft without dropping it. The participant who fumbled or fled first was deemed lacking in stamina or devotion, unfit for conjugal duties. More than one gentleman arrived at his wedding day with bruised arms and a disgruntled bunny, but the tradition persisted as a humorous, but daunting, ritual of commitment. Our next spectacle unfolds in the smoky courtyards of monastic infirmaries, the exorcism of erotic fever. Priests, convinced that unchaste desires were demonic in origin, performed midnight rites over afflicted novices. Through a haze of incense and Latin incantations, they plunged relic-filled bowls into holy water, anointed bodies with chrism oil, and struck the skin ever so gently to drive out the devil's lust. Onlookers, other monks bound by silence, vows, watched through narrow windows, certain that the frisson of forbidden pleasure was being expunged in service of divine chastity. Many recipients emerged shivering, convinced their sin had been washed away. A few suffered convulsions from ingesting over-concentrated holy water. Now, to the realm of gastronomic gallantry, the aphrodisiac banquet of bones. At certain banquets hosted by minor lords, dishes comprised marrow-filled bones of oxen, deer, and boar. The cooked bones were arranged in sensual patterns, and diners were instructed to suck the marrow while whispering love poems. Legend claimed the animal spirits infused the marrow with virility. Critics said it was mere status flaunting. Still, for a price, troubadours composed special verses to accompany each bone, and wine producers marketed vintage Venus Rouge as the perfect pairing. Guests, slathered in grease, emerged claiming nights of unprecedented vigor, though historians suspect the wine's high alcohol content played a larger role than any supernatural bone essence. Turning our gaze to the labor chamber corridors, we find the grotesque court of childbearing. When a noble woman approached childbirth, doctor midwives prepared a hempen cord knotted 13 times. After delivery, the rope was soaked in placental fluids, dried in the sun, and stored in the family's reliquary. Future mothers wore a fragment tied around the wrist for protection. Barren wives wrapped it at their feet overnight, praying for conception. The cord's macabre prestige fetched high prices at markets of relics, with forgeries rampant. Yet families guarded genuine cords jealously, believing them more potent than saintly relics, a testament to medieval faith in the body's mysterious powers. Next, the erotic codex of the weeping willow mirror. Artisans crafted handheld mirrors adorned with willow branches said to amplify emotions. Lovers stared into the reflective glass, running soft fingers along the willow carvings as they whispered confessions. Tears, real or feigned, were thought to break down heart barriers, fostering deeper intimacy. Some claimants even rubbed damp fingers on the willow to conjure tears on command. The practice, denounced by moralists, persisted in secret alcoves of noble women's boudoir, with mirrors passed down through generations as heirlooms of sentiment and secrecy. Now meet the bridal gag of silence, a cruel yet commonplace test of obedience. If a widow remarried hastily, local officials might require the bride to wear a silken cloth gag during the wedding mass, mounted on a small wooden frame, ensuring she uttered no word until the sacrament concluded. The gag served two purposes: preventing any impromptu objections, "Wait, I'm not ready," and reminding the bride of her vow of obedience. Should she speak, her dowry faced confiscation. Legends tell of frantic brides squeaking muffled protests, tears staining their veils, while priests banged lecterns in frustration. Our penultimate ritual hails from the misty forests of Eastern Europe, the Owl's Covenant. Young lovers seeking a lifelong bond would spear a live owl onto a tall pole, believing its nocturnal presence guarded their union. At dusk, they approached the pole, joined hands, and vowed fidelity before the bird's silent wings. The owl, revered as a seer, was thought to absorb lies and infidelity in its feathers. Once the ceremony ended, the owl was set free. Its future sightings, near or far, were interpreted as omens for the couple's future. Many owls never returned, and some were found injured, leading to whispered accusations of cursed unions. Finally, the legendary phantom consort. In sprawling castles across the British Isles, servants whispered of an unseen lover who visited lonely spouses at night. The specter arrived through keyholes, emitting faint breath on exposed skin, igniting pleasure beyond mortal capacity. Rumors described ethereal moans echoing through corridors, and cold fingertips tracing patterns on uncovered flesh. Skeptics blamed elaborate pranks by jealous attendants. Occultists claimed the phantom was a fey entity bound by a broken paction centuries earlier. Marital therapists of the day, often local clerics, offered prayers and protective talismans, but the legend endured. Even the most devout couples slept with lamps ablaze, half expecting ghostly silhouettes to join them beneath the canopy. Thus concludes our marathon through the strangest bedside theatrics ever staged in human history. From beagle detectives to haunted castles, from sacrificial soaks to bone marrow banquets, these final revelations remind us that medieval people, despite plague, famine, and rigid orthodoxy, pursued pleasure with relentless creativity. They rewrote the rules of intimacy, scripted rituals that defy modern logic, and ultimately revealed a timeless truth. In any age, the heart and the imagination will concoct the wildest paths to connection. May your bedchamber remain free of gongs, your bathwater pure, and your canine allies confined to leashes. And if you ever feel tempted by spectral paramours, remember, the safest nights are the ones spent with feet on solid ground and common sense firmly in place. Hey guys, imagine the world around you decaying like a carcass in the sun. Noxious fumes curl beneath your nostrils. Rats the size of your forearm scurry across sticky cobblestones, and every cough or gas might be your last. For the next 10 to 15 seconds, let me show you a tale of desire writhing through the pestilent streets of 14th century Europe, where passion and plague danced together in a grotesque waltz. In the spring of 1348, the Black Death swept across the continent with the fury of a vengeful god, collapsing entire hamlets into mass graves and turning bustling markets into ghost towns. Yet, amidst the clouds of pestilence, the throbbing pulse of human desire refused to be snuffed out. Men and women, their faces ghostly white from fever and fear, stumbled toward each other in candlelit hovels and ruined abbeys, seeking warmth, intimacy, and a fleeting escape from the terror that stalked them. By candlelight and gutter oil, our story unfolds in 4 acts, each a descent deeper into the abyss of love, lust, and lethal contagion. Part 1 begins in a small village outside Avignon, where crows circled the charnel pits like dark omens, and the local inn was repurposed as a makeshift infirmary. Here, we meet Marcellus, a barber surgeon who shaves plague victims by day and hides a feverish curiosity for the flesh by night. His hands, stained with the blood of sore and lance buboes, tremble as he approaches Isabeau, the farmer's daughter, whose pallid skin shimmers with sweat and dread. Isabeau's once rosy cheeks have hollowed, her laughter silenced by the rattling of her breath. Yet when Marcellus slips his hand under her threadbare smock, she responds with a shudder that is equal parts pain, pleasure, and disbelief. Their union is an act of defiance, a stubborn flicker of life against the suffocating grip of death. Their moans echo through the thatched barn, mingling with the distant lament of bagpipers hired to drown out the wails of the dying. But even as their bodies entwine, the specter of contagion looms. Marcellus applies the latest remedy from Italy, a poultice of crushed rose petals, mercury, and crushed mumia to his scalpel hand, hoping its magic will shield them from the unseen vermin within. They whisper forbidden prayers, invoking saints and sinners alike, as each touch feels like a gamble with fate. Around them, rats gnaw through thatch and human flesh alike, indifferent to the drama of desire playing out below. At dawn, they part, Isabeau to fetch water from a well, rumored to have been blessed by a holy hermit, Marcellus to collect a fresh supply of oiled wicks for the next round of clandestine liaisons. Their separation is brief. By dusk, the barn's shadows welcome their silhouettes once more. This cycle of fevered courtship and fearful retreat repeats nightly, a twisted dance scripted by the plague itself. Meanwhile, rumors swirl through the plague camps. Some claim that coupling under the open sky, beneath the unsheathed stars, will protect lovers from infection. Others swear that sleeping in a bed strewn with rue and mugwort wards off the disease's touch. Desperate souls cling to these whispered myths, erecting twig altars around their straw mats and chanting bawdy verses for protection. In corners of the infirmary, anonymous lovers scrawl erotic confessions on the walls, passages of desire rendered in charcoal, smeared with the grime of broken bodies. But the dance with death exacts its toll. The plague spares no one, not even these audacious lovers. One night, as Marcellus slides from Isabeau's arms, he feels a sudden chill. A tremor seizes his spine, and within hours his cheeks bloom with purple blotches. Panic gives way to delirium, yet even in his fevered haze, he reaches for Isabeau's hand, craving the comfort of flesh against bone. She hesitates, torn between compassion and fear of her own ruin. In that moment lies the crux of our medieval nightmare, the collision of passion and plague, where each embrace is a flirtation with oblivion, will desire triumph over death, or will love become the deadliest plague of all? Stay tuned for part 2, where we venture into the city of Avignon itself, where licentious cardinals, secret courtesans, and a carnival of contagion redefine the art of seduction under God's watchful eye. But, for now, remember, in the time of the Black Death, even the simplest act of intimacy was an act of rebellion, one measured in heartbeats and hostage to the grave. Picture this: crimson velvet drapes trembling in a candlelit hall, incense smoke curling like wraiths around stone columns, and the distant toll of church bells drowning out cries of the dying. Welcome to Avignon, 1348, the papal seat turned plague playground, where even God's earthly representatives couldn't resist temptation. Here in the court of contagion, cardinals swap theological treatises by day and tangled limbs by night. Enter Cardinal Benoit, pious veneer cracking as he slips through hidden corridors to Rosalinde's lair, La Rose Sanguine, courtesan extraordinaire. Her chambers, perfumed with frankincense and camphor, hold silver bowls filled with the city's most scandalous ingredients: a bishop's sweat, a merchant's bubo fluid, even the Pope's distilled tears. Rosalinde whispers ancient incantations, blending each drop into an aphrodisiac that promises immunity from the plague's grasp. Masked and cloaked, the elite converge on her velvet-lined alcove. Each carries a token: stained kerchiefs, cracked rosary beads, shards of crushed pearls, believing that ritualized intimacy can outpace death. As Cardinal Benoit kneels, trading rosary for garter, the streets outside choke on fetid perfume and fear. Peddlers hawk blessed bread laced with henbane to dull sorrow. Phantoms don skeletal masks at clandestine funerary bacchanals. Nightly, the procession of the last embrace winds through narrow lanes. A nobleman and his plague-racked lover march hand in hand, kissing before every church door, priests sprinkling holy water to ward off doom. Onlookers, peasant and pontiff alike, hope their shared absolution will bind the disease to stone rather than flesh. But when the midnight bells toll thrice, panic erupts. Cardinal Benoit stumbles, his crimson robe streaked with sacramental wine and carnal evidence. Rosalinde vanishes into secret tunnels, leaving behind emptied chalices and shattered vows. Amid the chaos, Marcellus and Isabeau, our fevered lovers, clutch hands and dash through labyrinthine alleys, guided only by distant bells and the promise of Avignon's ancient spring. Legend says its waters, if drunk at the new moon's first stroke, can cleanse any curse. Down the mossy stones they slip, lips meeting on a brackish draught that tastes of hope and desperation. Above, the papal palace looms, a gilded sentinel overlooking a city where sin and survival are inseparable. In Avignon, even the holiest souls gamble with contagion in the name of lust. Here, love is both shield and poison, every kiss a roll of the dice against death. Stay tuned for part 3, where plague-riddled bandits and exiled nuns forge forbidden alliances under moonlit canopies. Until then, clutch your crucifixes and your confidants tight. Desire in the time of the Black Death is a perilous pleasure. Beyond the reach of crumbling cities and sanctimonious pulpits lay the haunted forests of Provence, a lawless wilderness where piety was a memory and death wore no disguise. Here, survivors of the plague, too wretched or wicked for townsfolk to stomach, carved out desperate lives beneath canopies of ancient oaks and disease-blistered moonlight. Marcellus and Isabeau, fleeing the carnage of Avignon and the wrath of both man and microbe, slipped into these woods like ghosts seeking refuge. Their skin was scratched raw from brambles, and their breath was tinted with the musk of fear. Every shadow threatened an ambush. Every rustle in the leaves could herald a coughing corpse or a hungry thief with no scruples left to lose. But what they found instead was an unholy encampment of exiles, outlaws, heretics, and those declared too lecherous or infected for even the plague camps. At the heart of this fringe society was a woman called Mother Myriel, a former nun who once served in the Abbey of Sainte-Croix until it was converted into a charnel house. Her veil long discarded, she now wore a crown of dried fennel and a necklace of preserved teeth, tokens of those who had died in her arms or between her legs. Under her rule, the camp functioned as both commune and carnal confessional. Each night, survivors gathered around the fire to offer stories, flesh, and strange tributes, plague amulets carved from bone, ritual coitus under the hanging remains of a gallows tree, and whispered vows sworn beneath the milky gaze of the moon. It was part cult, part coven, and all survival. Marcellus, ever the scholar of absurdity, was both horrified and fascinated. He watched as men and women, boils festering, limbs wrapped in rags, locked bodies in fits of ecstasy, believing that climax expelled not just fear, but the very pestilence itself. Better to burn from within, one of them cackled, than rot slowly in God's silence. Isabeau, pale but resolute, began to assist Muriel in her nightly rites, anointing lovers with oils brewed from nettle, rue, and stale wine, chanting litanies that blended scripture with filth. The former nun taught her that confession through flesh was truer than any priest's blessing. "We're not sinners here," she declared. "We're survivors, licking the marrow from life's broken bones." There were rituals for everything. A fevered child was passed from lap to lap in a circle of naked women, each singing verses from forgotten psalms. Couples marked their lovers' backs with ashes before intercourse, as a sign they had touched death and dared desire anyway. The sick were sometimes pleasured to ease their passing, an act known only as the mercy lay. Among these woods people was an ex-monk called Thibaut, once a scribe in a Benedictine monastery, now covered in talismans and tattoos inked with pine soot. In blood, he kept scrolls of erotic poetry hidden inside dried pig bladders and recited them by firelight, while playing a harp made of horsehair and gut. One verse became a kind of anthem for the group. "The world is ash, and yet we burn. The flesh decays, but still we yearn. If death must come, then let him see." I kissed her lips defiantly. But even in this forest utopia of filth and freedom, the Black Death would not be outwitted for long. One morning, as a pale mist choked the trees, a band of plague riders, a militia sent by a nearby barony, descended upon the camp. Their orders: raze all settlements deemed unclean. Dressed in blackened armor and reeking of vinegar, they wielded torches and swords, shouting holy incantations and death sentences alike. The forest erupted in chaos. Lovers grabbed makeshift weapons, antler daggers, sharpened shepherd's hooks, and defended their newfound paradise. Isabeau fled into the woods with Muriel, bearing vials of salves and relics. Marcellus, gripped by fury and desperation, plunged a rusted scalpel into a rider's throat, before being knocked unconscious with a mace carved from holy stone. When he awoke, the camp was gone. Trees still smoldered, corpses smudged the moss with gore, and the perfume of burnt rosemary hung in the air. His limbs trembled not from fever this time, but from rage. He staggered to the sacred spring near the edge of the forest, where the community had once gathered to wash each other's wounds with petals and spit. There he found Isabeau, bloodied, exhausted, but alive, clutching a scorched strip of Muriel's veil. They drank from the spring again, now muddy with ash, and made a new vow, not merely to survive, but to bear witness, to carry the stories of this outlawed forest, its holy horrors and plague prophets, its lovers who danced on the precipice of damnation, into whatever future dared exist beyond the nightmare. They emerged from the trees as something changed, less lovers and more apostles of a terrible gospel. Their bodies bore marks, their eyes a distant fire, and the world they returned to was not one of healing, but of quiet ruin and rotting incense. Still, they walked hand in hand into cities where death had made space for the obscene miracle of continued life. Stay tuned for part 4, where our lovers reach the stinking canals of Venice, where masked doctors, desperate alchemists, and a final revelation await. In the end, the Black Death devoured many, but not all, and those who survived carried with them the proof that even in the age of pestilence, the hunger for flesh and feeling refused to die. The road from Marseille to Paris was littered with bones and promises, both broken and half fulfilled. As Marcellus and Isabeau trudged north, they passed villages abandoned to weeds and whispers. Each crumbled cottage told a story: a mother who buried her child under floorboards, a priest who locked his flock inside the church and set it ablaze, lovers who chained themselves together before slipping into the river. The land was mad. The sky was silent, but their feet kept moving. In the whispering woods near Bourges, the couple found a campfire ringed with survivors. mismatched remnants of a dying world, a Florentine juggler with one eye, a Moorish apothecary muttering incantations to invisible stars, a boy whose voice never broke and who claimed to be 73. They shared soup of questionable origin and traded stories too grim for daylight. Here, in the ash of civilization, desire did not disappear. It became feral. Isabeau, once a trembling farm girl, now led rites beneath the trees. She painted sigils on Marcellus's chest with mud and menstrual blood, chanted to forgotten fertility goddesses, and danced with bare feet and clenched fists. They no longer made love. They collided like wolves. Like things desperate to remember, they were still alive. Paris, they heard, was still standing. Barely. Its cathedrals choked with incense, its brothels working double shifts. The city had declared itself a sanctuary of the body, a place where death was to be seduced, outwitted, or at least kissed on the mouth. With every step closer, they passed shrines to saints no one remembered, and roadside crucifixes wrapped in women's undergarments. Death had taken everything, manners, morals, memory. Only impulse remained. They arrived on the feast of Saint Sebastian. The city throbbed with unholy revelry. Bishops wore masks shaped like phalluses. Prostitutes paraded as saints. On every corner, someone was either vomiting, confessing, or climaxing. Perfumed smoke veiled the stench. No one knew who ruled. No one cared. Paris had turned into a womb of chaos, a last ecstatic spasm before annihilation. In a candlelit tavern called La Peste d'Amour, Marcellus and Isabeau found a room with a cracked mirror and sheets that smelled of lavender and loss. There, they undressed for the 1000th time. Not as lovers now, but as survivors honoring the last rite they knew, flesh upon flesh, breath into breath, as the city crumbled outside. But even ecstasy rots when touched by plague. One morning, Isabeau awoke to find Marcellus cold, not stiff, not bloated, just cold. His hand still rested against her thigh. His mouth was parted slightly, as if he'd meant to say her name one last time. She did not scream. She simply covered his body with the bedsheet, walked naked into the street, and set La Peste d'Amour on fire. The flames danced with wild delight. For weeks, Isabeau wandered. She wore a crown of rosemary and spoke in riddles. Some called her a saint. Others called her a whore touched by divine madness. She anointed lovers with ashes and warned that only those who kissed with their eyes open would survive the next plague. Paris adopted her as its prophetess, until she vanished during a lunar eclipse, last seen walking into the Seine in a gown stitched from funeral veils. Legend says she still walks the riverbanks when the fog is thick and the rats grow bold. And so ends our tale. A tale of a time when to love was to gamble with the grave, when desire outpaced death only by inches, and when even the most fleeting touch could echo across centuries. Let it remind us, in the dirtiest, deadliest corners of history, it was never just the plague that spread uncontrollably. It was the hunger to feel, to touch, to live, even if only for one more kiss. Hey guys, imagine this. You're lying in a bed the size of a peasant's cottage, silk sheets clinging to your sweat, and just beyond the velvet curtain stands a man who has no testicles, but knows more about your body than your own spouse. Welcome to the royal bedrooms of antiquity, where the most powerful figure might not have worn a crown, but a belt with no bulge. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Let us begin with a simple but deeply uncomfortable truth. For thousands of years, if you wanted proximity to power, influence, and the freshest gossip in the empire, all you had to do was let someone remove your testicles. Yes, from imperial China to the Ottoman court, castration was less a punishment and more a career move. Eunuchs were the gatekeepers of the bedchamber, the spies in satin, the men permitted to see everything because they were allegedly not tempted by anything. In ancient China, eunuchs weren't just servants. They were bureaucrats, confidants, and sometimes the only people the emperor truly trusted. A eunuch could rise from scrubbing chamber pots to commanding armies or dictating foreign policy. Why? Because unlike other men, eunuchs could be allowed near the emperor's wives, concubines, and secrets without the looming fear of bedroom betrayal. Of course, that assumed the castration took, which wasn't always the case. There are records of eunuchs who, through medical miracle or strategic deception, retained more functionality than expected, leading to quite a few scandalous palace pregnancies. Take the case of Wei Zhongxian, a 17th century Ming dynasty eunuch who didn't just infiltrate the emperor's inner circle, he essentially became the emperor. With a voice like silk and a talent for flattery sharper than any sword, Wei maneuvered his way into absolute power, executing rivals, manipulating court politics, and whispering into the emperor's ear from behind the golden screens of the Forbidden City. His downfall came, as most do, from overplaying his hand and underestimating those who still had theirs. But the Chinese weren't alone in their strategic snipping. Let's glide westward toward the glittering palaces of the Byzantine Empire. Here, eunuchs were often placed in charge of the imperial bedroom, a role officially known as the Praepositus Sacri Cubiculi, which translates roughly to chief guy of all things bed-related. It sounds glamorous until you realize it involved everything from arranging imperial lingerie to organizing who got to sleep with the emperor and when. One of the most legendary eunuchs in Byzantine history was Narcissus, who went from being a palace servant to one of the most formidable generals the empire ever produced. With no prior military training and a body presumably lacking testosterone, he led armies to crush barbarian hordes with a strategist's mind and the kind of cold, calculated fury usually reserved for bad poets or tax collectors. So what made eunuchs so desirable in the royal bedroom? Was it the lack of threat, the perceived neutrality, or was it perhaps that people without sexual agency were believed to be safer vessels for power? In a world where lineage meant everything, a eunuch's sterility was ironically their greatest fertility. They could produce influence, proximity, and unwavering loyalty, all without ever risking an illegitimate heir. And yes, of course, some eunuchs were anything but chaste. The notion that removing the testicles also removed all desire is one of history's greatest fallacies. Many eunuchs had intimate relationships, some even with their royal employers. After all, nothing says trust like letting someone hold your secrets in your chamber pot. The Ottoman Empire elevated this to an art form. The black eunuchs, often taken from East Africa, were placed in charge of the harem, a space forbidden to all but the sultan, his wives, concubines, and, you guessed it, the eunuchs. These men controlled the flow of gossip, affection, and political maneuvering within the palace. They were judges, messengers, and sometimes executioners. In fact, the chief black eunuch of the Ottoman court was one of the most powerful figures in the empire, outranking viziers and whispering policies from within bejeweled curtains. But it wasn't all velvet and privilege. The path to eunuchhood was paved in blood and terror. Boys were taken, often by force, and mutilated in back-alley rituals that carried a higher mortality rate than most medieval battles. Many died from infection, others from despair. Those who survived often did so with a bitter clarity. If they couldn't reproduce, they would rule instead. In many cases, they succeeded. Imagine being the last voice the queen hears before she falls asleep, the first hand the emperor touches upon waking. The one who bathes the royal body listens to confessions in the dark, delivers messages between rival lovers, and decides which suitor gets to enter the bedchamber on any given night. Eunuchs weren't just bystanders to royal romance. They were the producers, directors, and sometimes co-stars of the grand theater of power and pleasure. In Persia, they were trained to detect lies in tone and posture, to memorize conversations without writing a word, and to recognize the scents of various lovers on the emperor's sheets. Their power was not just proximity, but perception. They knew when a royal was pretending to sleep, when a princess was about to cry, and when a prince's sudden illness was less about disease and more about poison. And, oh yes, poison. Many eunuchs were expert apothecaries, skilled in the mixing of aphrodisiacs, sleeping draughts, and venoms that mimicked natural death. After all, if you're the one who prepares the nightly wine or applies the scented oils, you can kill with a kiss, or at least with a well-placed tincture. What's perhaps most absurd, and darkly funny, is how so many of these royal courts considered eunuchs to be safe around women, safe from ambition, safe from scandal. But in reality, they were the most dangerous men in the palace. Because when you strip someone of the basic biological tools of traditional power, They often find other, more inventive ones: power through intimacy, influence through servitude, control through invisibility. And so concludes part 1 of our tale. Stay tuned for part 2, where we explore how eunuchs didn't just survive in royal bedrooms. They thrived, manipulating monarchs, launching coups, and rewriting entire dynasties from behind silk screens and whispered secrets. The Palace of Whispers was more alive at night than by day. Behind its high walls and beneath its golden domes, a different kingdom stirred. One ruled not by the kings who wore crowns, but by the men who had nothing left to lose. Eunuchs. They knew every creaking corridor, every secret passage behind the tapestries, and every rumor before it had a chance to ferment into truth. And in this second act of our descent into decadence, we follow these men with missing parts and overflowing power as they weave their way through the bedchambers of kings, queens, and concubines alike. The eunuch was not merely a servant. He was a guardian, a confidant, a spy, a gatekeeper of bodies and ambitions. While others jostled for favor in the throne room, the eunuch moved unseen through the royal boudoirs, oiling the hinges of canopy beds, adjusting silken pillows, and tucking in secrets beneath embroidered covers. His blade might have been taken early in life, but what remained was sharper than steel, a mind honed by survival and social acrobatics. Consider the Ottoman court, where the chief black eunuch, or Kuzlar Ah, outranked nearly every official save the Sultan himself. His quarters lay just outside the harem, a universe unto itself, sealed like a vault, but seething with rivalries, seductions, and plots. It was the eunuch who orchestrated the flow of bodies in and out of the Sultan's inner sanctum. Want to know who spent the night warming the emperor's sheets? Ask the eunuch, if you dare. Some eunuchs in their pre-castration days had been slaves. Others, promising boys purchased from desperate families, had their futures literally cut short in the name of palace service. They awoke from the knife into a new life, one that traded manhood for mobility. Inside the palace, they transcended their former class, acquiring riches, respect, and access that commoners could only dream of. Outside it, they remained pariahs, half men with full ambitions. And oh, the ambitions. Take China's infamous Ming Dynasty eunuch Wei Zhongxian, a master of manipulation who played the Forbidden City like a fiddle. He orchestrated purges, executed rivals, and even had temples built in his honor. He knew which concubine had secretly birthed a royal heir, which general had whispered treason, and which empress was smuggling opium into her powder box. Wei made himself essential, and then eternal, until his luck ran out, as it always did. The paradox of the eunuch was cruel and magnetic. Denied the pleasures of flesh, they became guardians of it. Robbed of reproductive power, they became the curators of dynasties. Forbidden from love, they read every stolen glance and muffled moan with forensic precision. They could not compete for affection, so they controlled its logistics. In some cultures, eunuchs were entrusted with the education of royal children, shaping future rulers with whispered wisdom and biting sarcasm. In others, they acted as double agents, smuggling letters between illicit lovers or blackmailing noblemen with knowledge gleaned from under the bed. Their greatest weapon? Invisibility. Courtiers ignored them, lovers overlooked them, kings underestimated them. Until one day, the entire court bent at the whim of a man who, by all outward appearances, was barely a man at all. In the royal harem of the Mughal Empire, eunuchs wore peacock feathers to denote rank, strutting through gardens heavy with jasmine and rumor. In the Byzantine court, they were considered ideal bureaucrats, unburdened by lust or lineage, and therefore incorruptible. This, of course, was laughable. And yet, for every eunuch who rose to unimaginable heights, there were 10 who died nameless, faceless, curled beside the beds they were never allowed to enjoy. Their stories were scrubbed from the gilded mirrors and replaced with fresh perfumes and new whisperers. But the memory of their scent lingered, the soft pad of slippers on marble floors, the careful fold of silk on a mistress's bed, the cold touch of a eunuch's hand drawing the curtain between pleasure and duty. In the shadows of royal bedrooms, power was not always loud. Sometimes it was silent, castrated, and waiting. Stay tuned for part 3, where we plunge into rebellion, betrayal, and eunuchs who decided they'd had enough of keeping secrets and started making some of their own. The rebellion didn't begin with a sword, but with a scroll, one thin slip of silk, smuggled beneath the eunuch's robe, sealed with wax and scented with rose oil, found its way into the private study of the crown prince. The message was simple, elegant, and treasonous. The hand that guards the bed may one day cradle the throne. Eunuchs had always whispered, but now they began to speak. In the late stages of the Tang dynasty, the imperial court seethed with rot. The emperor, bloated with wine and indifference, relied more on his eunuch advisors than his generals or ministers. And why not? Eunuchs didn't sire sons. They couldn't form bloodlines. Their loyalty was, in theory, absolute, except when it wasn't. Eunuch Tian Lingzi, one of the most infamous names in all of Chinese court history, began collecting secrets like others collected jade figurines. He knew who embezzled, who bribed, who lied. He also knew the crown prince loathed his father and had a taste for dangerous poetry. Tian leveraged this, orchestrating a coup that nearly brought the Tang house crashing down. He didn't crave the throne for himself. He simply wanted to decide who sat on it. Meanwhile, in India, the Mughal palace rippled with unrest. One eunuch, Khwaja Sara Lutfullah Khan, once entrusted with selecting concubines for the emperor's nightly indulgences, began to lose faith in the system he helped uphold. He had watched too many girls cry in gold-threaded robes, had buried too many friends whose only crime was knowing too much. He began slipping messages to court reformers, exposing the emperor's excesses. It started with quiet rebellion, shifting sleeping schedules, tampering with perfumes, planting seeds of mistrust among concubines. But it escalated, poisoned pomegranate seeds, locked doors at crucial moments, a horse that threw the emperor from the saddle at just the right bend in the path. Sometimes vengeance came in silence, but sometimes it wore eyeliner and planned assassinations by moonlight. In the Ottoman court, things got bloodier. The eunuch Bashir Aga, once a trusted master of the harem, was accused of conspiring with the mother of a disgraced prince to reinstate her son. Whispers turned to reports, reports turned to arrests. Bashir stood trial in the imperial council, stoic and immaculately dressed, defending his every move with honeyed words and centuries of protocol. But protocol has its limits. He was exiled in disgrace, but his network, spanning bathhouses, libraries, and apothecaries, remained intact. From afar, Bashir pulled strings no one else could see. Not every rebellion succeeded. Some eunuchs were caught, flayed, and fed to dogs as examples. Some were buried alive within the palace walls, forever trapped in the place they served so loyally. But others slipped away during a shift change, donned a merchant's robe, and vanished into cities where no one cared what had once been between their legs. But what made them rise up at all? Was it rage, boredom, a desire to matter in a world that had reshaped their bodies to make them safe? Perhaps it was simpler. Perhaps after years of making the palace run like a clock, they finally realized they didn't have to be cogs. They could be gears, or even the hand that pointed to midnight. By the late 17th century, European visitors to Eastern courts were shocked to discover just how powerful eunuchs had become. One French diplomat wrote, with no small degree of panic, "The kingdom is ruled by ghosts with no shadows." Ghosts, yes, but not silent ones, not anymore. Stay with us for part 4, where the eunuch's tale reaches its bittersweet crescendo, when the empires they upheld began to crumble, and the whispers in the bedroom echoed into the halls of history. The final chapters of the eunuch story were not written in gold leaf, but in ash and dust. As the Qing dynasty staggered toward its twilight, the Forbidden City, once the sacred engine of imperial China, echoed with footsteps that no longer bowed. Eunuchs, once feared, became relics. Their power eroded slowly, like ink washed from silk, yet a few still held fast to secrets, guarding chambers whose keys opened more than just doors. Sun Yoding, China's last imperial eunuch, watched it all unravel. He'd entered the palace as a boy, body cut to serve a dynasty already dying. By the time the last emperor, Puyi, was dethroned, Sun had memorized every creak of every wooden floorboard in the inner court. He had witnessed the empress cry into a lavender pillow, alone and dethroned, as Republican soldiers patrolled just outside the Vermilion Gates. When Puyi fled, Sun was left behind, holding the emperor's silk handkerchief and wondering if all that suffering had meant anything at all. In the Ottoman Empire, the abolition of the harem system came not with a bang, but with decrees. When Sultan Abdulmajid II was exiled in 1924, the black eunuchs, once omnipresent in the Topkapi Palace, disappeared almost overnight. Some became servants in aristocratic homes. Others found work in bathhouses or disappeared into Istanbul's underbelly. Their final revolt was a quiet one, surviving in a world that no longer had use for them, carrying memories like coins from a fallen currency. But perhaps the most haunting end came in the Mughal court, where the zenana, those great chambers of femininity and manipulation, were shuttered. The British had no use for harem politics, and so the eunuchs were cast aside. Some were mocked as grotesque symbols of decadence. Others were recruited as informants, their skills of observation turned toward colonial ends. One eunuch, known only in colonial records as Rafi, worked for both the Mughal princess he'd once served and the British East India Company. Double agent, survivor, betrayer, perhaps all three. In Europe, where eunuchs were less institutionally entrenched but equally mythologized, their legacy fared little better. Castrati singers, once the superstars of papal courts and opera houses, faded into silence with changing tastes and scandal. Alessandro Moreschi, the last known castrato, recorded his fragile voice onto wax cylinders in the early 1900s. The recordings are haunting, part angel, part ghost, the eunuch's swan song. And yet, despite the silencing, their presence lingers. The whisper of silk across marble, the scent of camphor in forgotten chambers, the hush before a royal secret is spoken. Eunuchs, those paradoxical figures, both intimate and invisible, left fingerprints on the very concept of power. They had been the watchers of queens, the gatekeepers of emperors, the spies who saw everything and said nothing, until they did. Historians still debate their impact. Were they manipulators or manipulated, power brokers or pawns? The answer, of course, is yes, all of the above. Their existence poses uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to serve with no future? To hold power but be denied legacy? To touch the heart of empire and never be allowed to call it your own? By the 20th century, the age of eunuchs was ending, but their influence still shadows palaces, novels, films, and folklore. From the powdered corridors of Versailles to the sun-scorched walls of Agra, their echoes remain, and perhaps that is their final act of rebellion, to be remembered, not as curiosities, not as victims, but as human beings who endured the most unnatural of fates and made it matter. So the next time you imagine a royal bedroom, perfumed, guarded, sacrosanct, picture the figure standing silently at the edge of the curtain. Not quite man, not quite servant, but something altogether stranger. The one who held the secrets, and sometimes the strings. Thank you for staying until the end. And remember, history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's whispered by the ones who had no voice. If you think modern contraception is weird, just wait until you hear what medieval people did to avoid having a baby. Spoiler, it involves crushed ants, crocodile dung, and more superstition than sense. Forget condoms and pills. Try dried beaver testicles or a wine-soaked sponge blessed by a monk. Welcome to the world of medieval birth control, where science met desperation in a candlelit dungeon, and women risked their lives just to avoid a ninth child before 30. Let's begin with the medieval mindset. Sex was both sacred and suspicious. The church loved to talk about abstinence, but conveniently forgot that humans are, well, humans. Celibacy was ideal, but procreation was duty. Pleasure? That was a trap set by the devil with scented oils and soft beds. So, in this moral minefield, how did people prevent pregnancy? Through a parade of the absurd, the dangerous, and the outright deadly. One of the most common forms of contraception in medieval Europe was herbal lore. Midwives, often the only accessible source of medical help for women, passed recipes from generation to generation. One such reliable concoction, a mixture of pennyroyal, rue, and savory, boiled into a bitter tea and drunk while praying very, very hard. These herbs did sometimes work. They were natural abortifacients, but in the same way a wrecking ball can technically open a door. Women often died of liver failure, internal bleeding, or simply wasting away. But at least they weren't pregnant. And then there was Queen Anne's lace, a wild carrot with supposed pregnancy-preventing powers. Medieval women would chew the seeds after sex like herbal tic-tacs for the uterus. Some studies today suggest these seeds might actually disrupt progesterone, so it's one of the few that wasn't complete fantasy. Still, chew too much and you'd end up with a mouthful of regrets and gastrointestinal chaos. But maybe you didn't want to drink poison. Maybe you preferred charms. Because what could be safer than a blessed amulet containing pulverized rabbit womb? Carried in a leather pouch and tied to the thigh, this furry contraceptive was said to confuse the body into believing it had already conceived. Or, better yet, wear a weasel's testicle around your neck. Yes, really. The logic was that since the weasel was a symbol of immaculate conception, probably because no one actually saw them mating, its body parts held magical birth control powers. Not to be outdone, medieval Islamic medical texts offer their own blend of science and superstition. Physicians like Avicenna and Al-Razi compiled lists of contraceptive methods that range from the somewhat plausible, like inserting wool soaked in vinegar or salt water, to the horrifying mixtures involving lead, mercury, or camel bile. One record even suggests placing a tampon of ground cedar resin and honey deep into the womb. This might actually have created a hostile environment for sperm, or just invited a host of angry infections. Either way, the goal was clear: no baby. And let's not forget the coitus interruptus method. Yes, even in medieval times, the withdrawal technique was known and scorned. Church doctrine labeled it as a sin akin to murder. In fact, spilling seed outside the body was considered worse than theft because you were robbing God of a soul. Medieval preachers warned that your hands would burn for eternity if you dared interrupt the sacred act. That didn't stop anyone, of course, but it certainly added a sprinkle of eternal damnation to your bedroom routine. Some women sought help from cunning women or witches, because let's be honest, medieval doctors were more likely to kill you with a leech than help your reproductive health. These wise women offered potions, chants, and rituals designed to close the womb or cool the humors. A typical recipe might include ashes from a burnt toad, wine boiled with crushed ants, or powdered bones of a saint, real or forged. Did they work? Probably not. But they gave desperate women something the church and physicians never offered: control. Meanwhile, across the medieval world, different cultures had their own peculiar takes. In ancient India, texts like the Kama Sutra, which, contrary to modern assumptions, is as much about philosophy and life guidance as it is about sex, describe methods like using ghee-soaked sponges or wearing certain gemstones to protect against conception. In China, some medical texts suggest using quicksilver or arsenic tonics, proving that nothing says contraceptive quite like slow, painful poisoning. But what about condoms? Oh yes, the medieval world had them. Sort of. In Asia, animal intestine sheaths were used for centuries, mostly to prevent disease rather than pregnancy. In Europe, linen sheaths soaked in chemicals were tied on with a ribbon. That's right, your medieval condom had a bow on it, but these were rare, expensive, and mostly used in brothels, where preventing syphilis was marginally more important than avoiding fatherhood. The real tragedy? Most of these methods weren't just ineffective, they were dangerous. The line between birth control and chemical warfare was razor thin, and because so many practices were oral traditions, passed from midwife to apprentice, from mother to daughter, once the church began to crack down on witchcraft, centuries of knowledge vanished with the flames. Midwives were accused of heresy, herbalists were hanged, and women were told to trust male doctors who prescribed cold baths and chastity instead of practical help. The great irony? Those same male doctors would later rediscover the very plants and methods they condemned, rename them in Latin, and declared themselves the fathers of gynecology. And in the background, women kept trying, because they had to. This was survival. For a peasant woman who'd already buried 2 children and watched her husband drink away the harvest, avoiding pregnancy wasn't about pleasure. It was about living long enough to see her remaining child grow teeth. For a noble woman, it was a matter of controlling inheritance, scandal, or political leverage. For a nun, it was silence, shame, and whispered visits from priests who insisted they came only to pray. So, the next time you hear someone claim that birth control is a modern invention, remember this. Medieval women were chewing toxic seeds, boiling hedgehog fat, and strapping lizard skins to their thighs centuries before the pill ever hit the market. And they did it with no internet, no rights, and no choice. Stay tuned for part 2, where we dive deeper into bizarre regional customs, royal scandals, and contraceptive failings so absurd they make abstinence look fun. Welcome back to the darkest corners of the medieval bedroom, where superstition wore a midwife's apron and desperation dripped from every candlelit crevice. In part 2, we travel deeper into the strange, regional, and often catastrophic world of medieval contraception. If you thought herbs and holy relics were weird, wait until you hear about animal bladders, moon cycles, and the Catholic Church's war on your uterus. Let's begin in Italy, land of popes, pasta, and poorly understood anatomy. In the back alleys of 14th century Florence, women visited comari, local herbalists/gossip hubs who offered everything from love potions to womb blockers. One of the most popular birth control methods was inserting cypress oil-soaked linen balls into the vagina. Why cypress? Because it was cooling, and medieval people were obsessed with balancing the body's hot and cold humors. If your womb was too hot, conception was inevitable. Too cold? Infertility? So naturally sticking tree-scented fabric up there sounded like a great idea. Spoiler, it wasn't. It often led to infections that killed faster than childbirth. Meanwhile, in France, the wealthier classes had access to a more luxurious solution. Conception pearls. These were beads made from powdered minerals and herbs, encased in wax, and inserted before intercourse. They were worn like a royal tampon and believed to be both protective and aphrodisiac. Of course, many of these pearls included ingredients like lead and mercury, which, true, did lower fertility. By slowly murdering you. Ah, romance. But let's take a detour to Ireland, where Christian beliefs mingled with Celtic folk medicine. Here, the line between medicine and magic was a fine green mist. Women tied knot charms to their beds made from red thread, menstrual blood, and bird feathers. They whispered ancient spells invoking the goddess Brigid, asking for protection from seed and man rage. According to surviving texts, women were told to avoid conception by not looking at the moon too long, or sleeping with garlic in the armpit. Accurate? Number hilarious? Absolutely, but it shows the medieval understanding of fertility was more astrological than biological. In Germany, monks secretly compiled texts on contraceptive practices hidden between pages on scripture and beekeeping. One such manuscript recommended placing a slice of raw onion inside the vagina before sex. If, the next morning, your breath smelled like onions, the womb was considered open and conception was likely. If not, you were safe. This womb smell test became strangely popular among the peasantry. Naturally, it had zero medical basis and probably made sex smell like a tavern kitchen. And then, there was Spain, where the church's grip was ironclad and tight around every bedroom. Spanish women, particularly Moorish ones under Christian rule, resorted to camphor and vinegar douches, despite the high risk of internal burns. Some even inserted tiny bits of cactus pulp as spermicidal barriers, because if it stings, it must be working. Others turned to more spiritual methods, keeping blessed communion wafers in their stockings during sex to trick God into thinking they were at Mass, not mid-fornication. Bold move, ladies. Let's not forget Eastern Europe, where Slavic folk medicine collided with Orthodox morality in gloriously grotesque ways. One belief claimed that rubbing bear fat mixed with crushed garlic onto the lower abdomen would repel the seed. In Russia, some midwives recommended drinking boiled frog skin in kvass, a fermented bread drink, to sour the womb. If that didn't work, a common follow-up was applying a poultice of charred rat bones and vinegar over the belly button while chanting psalms backward. Across the sea, in medieval England, things weren't much better. Women were advised by traveling physicians, usually men who smelled like mildew and had zero gynecological training, to carry badger testicles in their pockets or to wear a dried eel around the waist. One manuscript earnestly suggested avoiding sex during a full moon, especially if Mars is in the house of Venus, because sperm, apparently, obeyed astrological weather reports. And yet, among all the absurdity, one thread binds these cultures together: fear. Fear of pain, of death in childbirth, of losing status, of losing life. Women lived in a world where pregnancy was a punishment, not a blessing, and so they resorted to anything, no matter how painful, how ridiculous, how wildly unscientific, to escape it. Now, while women were crawling through herbal hell, what were the men doing? Mostly blaming women. Male philosophers and theologians spent centuries debating whether women who used contraception were witches, temptresses, or just too lazy to die in childbirth like God intended. A particularly venomous priest named Jacques de Vitry wrote that any woman who used contraceptive herbs let the devil into her womb. He also believed menstrual blood caused leprosy, so there's that. The church's grip on sexuality was relentless. Intercourse was strictly for procreation. Anything else, oral sex, masturbation, non-missionary positions, was condemned as sinful. But let's be clear, the enforcement of these rules was highly selective. Wealthy men could buy indulgences or pay off their sins. Women? Not so much. Especially poor women, who were often the ones most desperate to control their fertility. This created a black market of reproductive knowledge. Networks of women, healers, midwives, nuns with loose lips, kept ancient traditions alive in whispers. They traded recipes for moon teas, taught each other how to insert barrier methods, and passed coded messages in embroidery and prayer books. They lived one misstep away from accusations of witchcraft, and then came the plague. When the Black Death swept through Europe, killing a third of the population, fertility paranoia exploded. Some saw the plague as divine punishment for sexual sin. Others blamed contraception itself. In response, cities cracked down. Midwives were arrested. Herbalists were tortured. Even women with knowledge of safe childbirth were seen as suspicious. If too many of your patients lived, you were probably in league with Satan. And yet, somehow, the knowledge survived, tucked into secret diaries, hidden in family cookbooks, whispered during labor pains. Humanity's oldest struggle, sex without consequence, continued. In Part 3, we'll travel east, to the harems of the Ottoman Empire, the concubines of Ming China, and the temple courtesans of India, where power, pleasure, and pregnancy collided in spectacular, scented chaos. Welcome to Part 3, where we sail east and plunge headfirst into the perfumed, paranoid, and exquisitely controlled world of ancient birth control, where queens had no freedom, concubines had too much, and eunuchs whispered secrets into silk screens. Welcome to the harems, temples, and tea houses where fertility wasn't just biology, it was politics, poetry, and peril. Let's start in the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan's harem wasn't a den of lust, but a labyrinth of protocol, plotting, and pelvic vigilance. The harem housed hundreds of women, but only a few ever shared the Sultan's bed. Birth control wasn't just about avoiding pregnancy, it was about controlling which womb would bear the future ruler. The stakes were so high that eunuchs administered contraceptive schedules as if they were orchestrating military campaigns. Inside the harem, favored concubines were often given spermicidal pessaries made from honey, cedar resin, and pomegranate rind. They were inserted hours before intimacy and, according to court gossip, sometimes switched out at the last moment by rivals seeking to sabotage a pregnancy. Pomegranate, long considered a symbol of fertility, was ironically used here to stop it. How poetic and petty. But in case you think the Ottomans were all high concept and low sympathy, consider this. They also used weasel testicles worn around the thigh as an amulet to deflect seed. It didn't work, obviously, unless you count horrifying your partner into celibacy as a method. Moving eastward to Ming Dynasty China, where Confucian restraint clashed with real-world necessity. In a court filled with thousands of concubines, the emperor had the libido of a man backed by divine right, and the fertility rate of a monk. That's because birth control wasn't a secret, it was state policy. Chinese medical texts from the period describe oral contraceptives made from mercury, lead, and arsenic. Yes, poison cocktails sold as pearls of chastity. These were distributed among lower-ranking concubines to ensure that only select women, usually from powerful families, had a chance to produce heirs. Did it work? Yes. Did it cause horrific side effects, early death, and infertility? Also yes. More benign alternatives included teas brewed from cotton root bark, wild yam, and papaya seeds, which were used by both courtesans and married women. These natural contraceptives were passed down in secret books, known as women's classics, written in delicate calligraphy and hidden beneath sewing baskets. They were dangerous to own and even more dangerous to share, but share they did, because in a world where bearing the wrong child could mean exile or execution, silence wasn't an option. Meanwhile, in the Indian subcontinent, Temples echoed with chants, jasmine, and the sound of political contraception. In southern India, Devadasis, sacred temple dancers who were neither wives nor prostitutes, used contraceptives to maintain autonomy in a patriarchal religious structure. One common method was the use of neem oil, applied vaginally before intercourse. Neem was praised in Ayurvedic texts as a natural spermicide, and it was surprisingly effective for the time. These women often drank infusions of papaya leaf, asafoetida, and turmeric, believed to suppress ovulation. And unlike in Europe, where fertility was a curse, here, contraception was seen as spiritual hygiene, keeping the body sacred, the dance uninterrupted, and the temple politics clean. But let's not forget the tantric courtesans of North India, who lived lives laced with paradox. They were forbidden from marrying, yet expected to master seduction. Their weapon of choice? Lotus seed pastes mixed with alum, inserted before intercourse to close the gate of life. Courtesans were also known to wear belts laced with crushed pearl powder and ghee, believed to create an energy field hostile to conception. Science? Number. Symbolism? Absolutely. These belts, glittering and useless, were a protest, draped in gold and screaming, "I will not breed for your lineage." Now, let's glide into Japan, where the elite women of the Heian court dressed in 12 layers of silk, but were barely protected from pregnancy. The favorite method of birth control? Abstinence with flair. Women wrote letters to their lovers detailing dreams of blood and fire, politely explaining that they were unwell, or that the moon goddess had forbidden intercourse. Subtle, poetic, and backed by zero medical reasoning. When poetry didn't work, women turned to moxa burns. Yes, burning mugwort on the lower abdomen to heat the womb shut. Others used small, hand-carved wooden plugs, inserted before sex and often coated in vinegar or ash. It was like using a doorstop to prevent a flood. Needless to say, infections were rampant. Some prostitutes in Edo period Japan chewed persimmon stems to reduce fertility, while others mixed turtle shell ash into their tea. Was this effective? Possibly. Was it safe? Never. But again, the choice was clear: experiment or die trying. Because motherhood was never just about babies. It was about class, survival, and sacrifice. And through all these regions, China, India, Japan, the Middle East, one truth echoed: the more power a man had, the less control a woman had over her own womb. And so, the smarter women became chemists, herbalists, poets, and warriors, all wrapped up in silk and incense. And what of the men? Many indulged, many ignored, a few even helped. Some emperors permitted contraceptive knowledge to spread, usually to protect their dynastic plans. Others banned it entirely. But in every palace, temple, and bathhouse, women carried the real burden: to bear children at the whim of a throne, or to dodge fate in secret. In Part 4, we'll cross oceans into the indigenous Americas in sub-Saharan Africa, where birth control was woven into myth, magic, and the brutal realities of survival in colonial times. There, the knowledge passed through songs, dreams, and scars, and still, the stakes were just as high. Let us now step into the final chapter of our tangled journey, a continent-hopping, colonizer-dodging, survival-by-seed finale, where birth control was less about choice and more about life or death. Because when invaders arrive with muskets, Bibles, and diseases, reproductive autonomy becomes an act of rebellion. Welcome to the Americas and Africa, where women carved out power in the spaces left behind by empire, and where the war for the womb took on new, ancient, and often terrifying forms. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and Mayans had an impressively detailed pharmacopoeia. Women brewed teas from the Mexican yam, Dioscorea villosa, rich in natural progesterone, and used intravaginal applications of crushed crocodile dung and tree sap to block sperm. Was it comfortable? Was it effective? Shockingly, yes. And this wasn't back alley folk medicine. This was state-supported gynecology, overseen by priestesses and herbalists trained in temples. Midwives were among the most revered healers in Aztec society. They didn't just deliver babies, they decided whether they should be born at all. A woman could go to her midwife and receive a precise herbal regimen to delay or prevent conception, and if something went wrong, there was a chant, a ritual, a god to invoke. Fertility was sacred, but sacred did not mean mandatory. After colonization, however, Spanish priests labeled all of it heresy. Herbal contraception became witchcraft overnight. Women were stripped of midwives, stripped of plants, stripped of language. But the knowledge didn't die. It went underground, into whispered recipes, hidden bundles of herbs sewn into skirts, passed from grandmother to granddaughter in kitchens and fields, beyond the reach of any holy inquisition. Further south in Andean Peru, Quechua women used wild potato varieties, some with natural contraceptive properties, and chewed coca leaves mixed with powdered minerals to affect their cycles. Birth control here wasn't shameful, it was strategy. You couldn't afford 6 kids on a mountainside when one frost could kill your entire crop. Nature was unpredictable, and so women learned to manipulate their bodies to match. But once the Spanish set up their mines and missions, reproduction became less about survival and more about labor output. More babies meant more workers. Indigenous birth control was brutally repressed, and forced pregnancy became a tool of colonial control. Yet still, resistance survived, in riverside shamans, in forest-gathered roots, in dreams that warned when not to conceive. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, on the African continent, birth control was magic, medicine, and memory. In West Africa, among the Yoruba and Akan peoples, women drank infusions of hibiscus, baobab bark, and guinea pepper to prevent pregnancy. Some even wore fetish necklaces blessed by priestesses, beads representing a locked womb, enchanted with prayers, songs, and blood. In these societies, birth control wasn't always hidden. Women had the right to space their children and determine when they were ready. Fertility was power, yes, but so was withholding it. Then came the slave trade. When African women were captured and sold into bondage across the Atlantic, they took what they could, not belongings, not names, but knowledge. Enslaved women in the Americas remembered. In the rice fields of South Carolina, women chewed cotton root bark to prevent ovulation, a method that later appeared in 19th century medical journals, baffling white doctors who couldn't understand how their property wasn't reproducing. In Jamaica and Brazil, enslaved women grew papaya trees near their quarters and used the unripe fruit as both food and contraceptive. Some boiled the seeds into tea, others made a paste with ashes and pepper to insert before intercourse. These women weren't just trying to avoid pregnancy, they were resisting breeding for the profit of someone else's plantation. Slave owners often punished suspected users of birth control, but they never fully understood it, because the real power of these women wasn't in hiding, it was in remembering. Even as European doctors declared themselves the ultimate authority on the female body, their success depended on data quietly stolen from the midwives and herbalists they outlawed. Nearly every new discovery about fertility in the 18th and 19th centuries was something someone's grandmother in Ghana or Guatemala already knew by heart. And let's be honest, the real shock isn't that medieval birth control existed. It's that despite centuries of colonial violence, religious terror, and misogynist science, it persisted, handed down like lullabies, like legends, like survival itself. By the dawn of the 20th century, as glass syringes and rubber condoms made their way into pharmacies, the world believed it had outgrown the old ways. But peel back the label on any modern contraceptive, and you'll find echoes of neem, cotton root, papaya, alum, and ash. Old world whispers hiding in your new world pill. And so, we arrive at the painful irony. The past, with all its brutal improvisations and half-poisoned brews, was also a place of creative resistance. Birth control wasn't just a practice, it was a declaration. I choose not to die in childbirth this year. I choose not to bear my rapist's child. I choose to live one more season with my body as mine. These weren't women with options. These were women with nothing, and yet they reached into the dirt, pulled up roots, and invented agency. Let that be the final note, not shock, but awe. Because history, at its most absurd and cruel, is also where we find our oldest acts of quiet, furious, breathtaking control.